We're going to start in Porto Alegre, which is where we're landing here, but we're not going to stay there. Porto Alegre is a large delta city, Brazilian. It's a state capital. Yeah, okay. Yeah, you want to play some music? Good for you. It has a very active port, large population. It's actually best known outside Brazil, really for participatory budgeting. It has a lot more going on, but when you hear Porto Alegre outside of Brazil, the conversation is usually going to go something like this. We're going to talk about what happened in Brazil when, again, there was a constitutional change that triggered a dramatic change in how money was allocated. Go back to 1988 in the Brazilian Constitution. The Workers' Party that same year in Porto Alegre sees an opportunity. They campaign, here's that theme again, they campaign on democratic reform, an inversion of spending priorities. We need to focus the money on the most local problems. And they're quite successful. When they're reelected in 1992, you kind of got the feeling that they're onto something. And again, I want to underscore, we can say that the Workers' Party officials who came up with that campaign idea, we can say they were enlightened, that they wanted deliberative democracy and they were ahead of the curve. But we can also just say they were just the same mean old SOBs that run every political party, but they were shrewd. There's nothing wrong with political strategy and democratic ideals going hand in hand, and they've been tremendously successful in Porto Alegre. Just as we saw with the Kerala example, it really amounted to a mass mobilization. You're getting 20,000 people a year into these very local meetings, and again, as you're going to see in a video in just a second, there's going to be a multi-layered process, but at these very local levels, you're getting a huge number of people participating. And in this case, unlike Kerala, we actually have an over-representation of the poorest of the poor because they were very consciously mobilizing those populations to come to the meetings. By 1999, you get this 20,000 figure, but by 2002, you've really got participatory budgeting entrenched in Porto Alegre. Now, as I said, we're not going to stay in Porto Alegre. We're actually going to move to Recife, which is in another part of Brazil, but before we go to the video, I just want to say why Recife is now on our radar. 2001, they start fooling around with participatory budgeting, and they do an incredibly good job with it. Such a good job that in 2011, a German civic association awarded a prize for kind of the best innovation in participation and democracy, and the competition was brutal. A couple of the processes you're seeing up here were near the top of the finalists. This was the winner. This process was, they thought, the most effective in the world. So let's just take a quick glimpse. I like these little short videos because you get a little bit of feel for the texture of what this actually looks like and how you organize it, where people sit and so on. So
every year, municipal authorities set up a participatory budget where citizens can bring in their own suggestions, particularly for urban development measures in their region. A comprehensive network of helpers informs the residents accordingly. In meetings in all regions of the city, the citizens can then choose 10 of the suggested projects for their micro-region. In plenary forums on special topics, they can also decide which measures should be implemented in the 15 political areas, such as education, youth, senior citizens, and culture. In contrast to the regional forums, programs for the entire city are developed here. Both in the regional and plenary forums, the participants subsequently elect delegates who accompany the further process and dispatch members to a budget advisory council. This council drafts a budget on the basis of the selected projects, which is then passed by the municipal council. So that the citizens can also be involved in the implementation of the projects, a commission is set up for every measure. Since the introduction of the participatory budget, more than 3,000 projects with a value of 220 million euros have been implemented, mainly in the poor regions. In 2010, more than 100,000 people participated in this process.
So, as you can see, again, it's another example of participatory budgeting. You get a sense for the scale of it. I mean, we really are talking about, when we start aggregating these across different places, we're talking about billions of dollars, and we're talking about dramatic changes in how money is being spent. It's actually, of all these processes, this is the one that's kind of caught on across the globe, and that's exciting, as this is a map just showing all kinds of places that have one kind of participatory budgeting or another. But let's go to the downsides again for a second. sure, it's copied all over the globe, but just like when you copy things in a sci-fi movie, right? About the fifth or sixth copy starts sounding kind of weird and squirrely and has like 12 arms, and it's supposed to only have one. And that's what's happening with participatory budgeting to some degree. One of the biggest sort of copy problems is people see the process and say, that sounds cool, and leave the process completely advisory, which means that now expectations have been raised quite high, and they might be asking for things that can't be delivered for various legal reasons or fiscal reasons, and there's a breakdown. And you can actually wind up causing more harm than good because now you've delegitimized the deliberative process that does work when you hook it up right. There's also been a problem in that sometimes it does become a mobilization contest. It's a question of who can get their peeps there and press hard enough for one interest or another, and that may not be in the larger public interest. And it's for that reason that some people have turned to processes like the third and fourth that we're about to see, where they actually try using some random sampling, which you heard mentioned in earlier comments. And that presents its own problems, but it creates a tremendous advantage in terms of the representativeness of who participates. So to get a sense for that, let's go ahead and jump forward and take a look at our third process. We'll leave Brazil here, and we'll just kind of shoot our way up into Canada. Kind of go through Central America. Oh, did you see that Grand Canyon? You missed it? Oh, well, I'll keep the window open. And here we are in Vancouver. We're very happy that the video is working. The audio was kind of a 50-50. What you would have heard right now is a song from the show Due South, the most successful Canadian show to have been brought to the United States. Indeed, a national treasure. The hero of that show, he's been called that, Paul Gross, would have been singing to you, in fact, a song about Alberta, appropriately enough. Or not, since we're in Vancouver. But, you know, I thought we'd let that fly, because it's, oh, there you go. Get a little music. The British Columbia, Vancouver, was the host to the Citizens' Assembly, and it was an incredible innovation in that it was the first time we'd seen a random sample of citizens gathered together to actually create legislation. And how did it come about is kind of bizarre. It really gets back to somebody teaching a class who was kind of talking to students about an idea and the Greeks and random sampling and so on. Meanwhile, there's a whole literature on deliberative democracy emerging. They knew nothing about it. They just kind of said, hey, you know, what about this idea? And it got to a party official and they said, let's campaign on it, and you get yourself this little timeline, okay? So let's talk about the BC Liberals just for a second. In 1996, they had themselves a very frustrating election. They got 42% of the vote. It sounds okay, but actually it was a plurality. Nobody got more. That 42% earned them 33 of the 72 votes in the Assembly. That's got to be annoying. You get more votes than anyone else, and you wind up with a minority share. So when they campaigned, they kicked in this idea, among other things, and said, we might use this, random sample assembly thing to change the electoral system, try to make it more fair. Well, they got kind of stuck because in 2001, they got 58% of the vote. That was great, but they got 77 out of 79 seats because remember, the system doesn't work quite well. So they were kind of like, oh yeah, let's change the system, which just totally advanced us. But it was cool. They did. They held a citizens' assembly. They got the thing established in 2003. 2004, the assembly deliberates. We're going to get a glimpse of what they did. And then in 2005, that assembly's recommendation for a new way of counting votes was put to a vote of the whole province. So let's take a look at this thing they cooked up in practice and just kind of get a feel for what it looked like.
British Columbia has become a world leader in involving citizens in public policy development. When our province created the Citizens' Assembly on Electoral Reform in 2003, it was a historic event. Never before had democracy given randomly selected citizens so much power. The 160 members of the Assembly were all volunteers who were randomly selected from the voters' list. 80 men and 80 women came from every area of the province in all walks of life. The Citizens' Assembly was given a unique and important job: learn and make recommendations about the way our governments are elected. The first stage of their work was to study and examine electoral systems used in democracies around the world. They met from January to March of 2004 to hear from experts and learn about different voting systems. 50 public hearings were held during May and June 2004 in communities throughout BC. allowing Assembly members to hear what their fellow citizens have to say.
So after those public hearings, they get to the point where they're crystallizing a final recommendation, and that final recommendation was single transferable vote. Show of hands, how many people know with full confidence that you could describe to this room what single transferable vote is in about 3 minutes or less? For those on the web, I don't know if your hands are up, but there's about 8 hands up here out of an audience of thousands. Thanks a lot. You got my back there, people. Let's just say not many people raised their hand. Well, as it happens, single transferable vote is a pretty cool kind of technical way of counting votes. And when they said they heard from people from around the world, I just wanted you to get your head around that. You're one of these randomly selected 150 people in that beautiful facility you saw there, right? That's from the Simon Fraser University downtown campus, the Center for Dialogue. What a beautiful thing that is. But you've got these experts flying in from around the world to talk to you. And if you raise your hand and say, okay, slow down, Poindexter, when you say transferable vote, you lost me. Okay, we got all the time in the world. Let's slow it down, right? Let's talk about it. And they understood exactly what it meant. I guarantee you they did. But just what an honor to have all these people working with you all the time you need to work through that. They came up with a very wonky recommendation. And in 77 of the 79 ridings in British Columbia, it got a majority of the vote. Overall, it got 57% of the vote. Now, they needed 60% for it to pass. So the net effect was to not change the electoral system. There's just another glimpse of that facility. Well, Ontario thought, okay, that was actually pretty sweet. We want to do that. So Ontario held a citizens' assembly in 2007. The recommendations that came out of that body got 37% of the vote. British Columbia said, yeah, well, you know what? We thought our assembly was awesome, but our election was kind of pathetic. This time I'm going to actually give money, the government said, to the pro and con. We'll have a better debate, and we'll talk it through. I know it's getting kind of stale, but, you know, it's sitting on top of the fridge. Somebody's got to eat it. 2009, it gets 38% of the vote. Now, one of the reasons it did as well as it did is survey research has showed that as many as a third of the people who supported the single transferable vote, like many of the people in this room said, not sure what that is, but I do understand how the recommendation came about. It was this random sample. It was cool. People like me, they said it's a good idea. I'll figure out what it is once it's, you know, the new law, but I'm voting for it. Fast forward a few years and it's like, the what did who now? And you're down to 38% support. But it's an interesting example of the power of this deliberative cue, that one deliberative body can kind of signal to a larger body some interesting ideas, but maybe it would be better if more information came in that signal, and we're going to see that in just a second. The other thing that's kind of problematic about it, looking back on it, some of the people involved in it said we were too far apart from government. I mean, you'd think it wants to be separate from government, right? But the problem was it really distanced itself such that even the BC Liberals who had sponsored it were kind of like, yeah, we created this process, and then you're like, we don't want to talk to you. And, you know, it felt kind of snippy. In the end, they came up with a solution. Their only goal was to come up with the best voting system for British Columbia. In retrospect, I would suggest there's 2 criteria. That's the first one, the best system. Second criterion, that people can understand easily, right? I mean, I understand you don't want to dumb it down too much, but did you have to go for single transferable vote? Anyway, I'm just saying, you got to think about the political reality. And this next process we're going to see does that in a different way. But fortunately for our little flights around the world, we don't have to go too far. All we have to do is just kind of go down a little bit from British Columbia through the state of Washington, where I lived for many years, wonderful place you should visit, to Salem, Oregon, the capital there.